the economic warfare basically is we're not going to let anybody trade with our enemies that will prevent them from being able to prosecute the war. So the British then declared a blockade around the North Sea and in the Mediterranean to prevent anybody from trading with the Central Powers. And then at the same time, the Germans are going to announce a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which will say that they'll declare what they call an exclusion zone around the British Isles, and they'll say that anybody that is caught within the exclusion zone can be sunk without um, without warning. Okay, so basically, then what the British are saying is nobody trade with Germany, and what the Germans are saying is nobody trade with Britain. Who's nobody? What country insists on free trade?
The United States.
United States, exactly. So what's going to happen is that the United States will basically be angry with both Germany and Britain. And one of the things that we need to understand is that at this point, the United States and Britain weren't great allies like we are theoretically today, right? We didn't think about Britain as our mother country or our cousins across the ocean. Many people still did what they called waving the red flag, or waving the red shirt, which was basically that the British had been the tyrants that the Americans had broken away from. And if you'll recall, we talked about last week how the United States almost went to war with Britain in 1894 over Venezuela. So, and on top of that, there were many Irish people living in America, and the Irish didn't have any great fondness for England. And at the same time, there were many Germans living in America, and they did have fondness towards Germany. Do you guys follow what I'm saying? So America wasn't automatically on the side of the British. In fact, the United States, again, tried to stay neutral, and there was sentiment on both sides in the United States. So there were many people in the United States who supported the British, and there were many people in the United States who supported the Germans, okay? The president supported Britain. The reason why the president, who's president now?
Woodrow Wilson.
Woodrow Wilson, right. So the reason why the president supported Britain was because Britain was allied with France, and what was the similarity? What was common between the government of Britain and the government of France? And what would be common about the government of Britain and the government of France and the government of the United States? What kind of government did they have? Democratic, a liberal government. So Britain and France are both liberal countries. The problem is Russia isn't. Russia is one of the most anachronistic monarchies. It's essentially, its government system hasn't really moved much beyond the Middle Ages, okay? So when Wilson is in favor of Britain and favors Britain and France in the war, he does so because they're democratic countries. Germany, Hungary, and Italy are all monarchies. And so the idea then is that he wants to support the spread of democracy. But because of the fact that if the United States entered the war, it would also be allied with Russia, he was reluctant to get the United States involved in a war. Okay, you guys are with me? So now what happens is with this trade blockade, what we see is what I talked about last week with the foundation really of American foreign policy, which was that the United States had agreed not to interfere in European affairs, but also insisted on free trade. And what we see happening then is that the United States is faced with either interfering in European affairs or giving up their right to free trade. And so what we'll see then is that's going to actually be an argument that happens in the United States. Should the United States get involved in the war to support its free trade or not? Okay. And then we already talked about missionary diplomacy. How did Wilson view the conflict? Which was, I have to say this, the conflict itself was over world empire. The empire, was it going to be the British and the French that are going to maintain their world empire, or is this new power Germany going to rival them? And neither side really were fighting for government. They weren't fighting for democracy or for monarchy or any of those things. They were fighting for empire. Okay. But the United States is not worried about, they don't care about empire. What they care about, or at least what Wilson cares about, is democracy. Okay. So the United States will get involved in the war, but it gets involved in the war because of a different reason than the war is actually being fought. And we'll have to kind of think if we can see that again sometime in the weeks coming up. All right. So now what happens in 1915, the British sink a ship. The ship's called the Lusitania. Here's a kind of this is what the front page of the New York Times looked like. The Lusitania was actually a British ship, but it was carrying a lot of Americans. It was also carrying American war material, which is probably one of the reasons why it was sunk. But the Germans were pursuing their policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. The problem with unrestricted submarine warfare was that it broke the rules of maritime warfare, which was, at this time, if you were going to attack a merchant vessel, you had to give them the opportunity to surrender. So what would happen in theory was that the war vessel would approach the merchant vessel and fire a shot across their bow. You've heard that before, right? Fire one across their bow. Okay. And then when they fired one across their bow, then the merchant vessel could either surrender, or then they could be sunk if they didn't surrender. Okay. But what happens with a submarine is that if a submarine surfaces and tries to warn the merchant vessel, they're so weak, they're so vulnerable that the merchant vessel might even be able to sink them. So they don't do it. It's all done secretly, unrestricted. And the result of that then is that they sink these ships without warning. And that was seen as a great violation of the rules of war. Okay. Now we have to think about this for a second, because it's only the West that thinks about the rules of war. If you think about what war is the absence of rules. If you think about it, right? Okay. But the West is going to be able to say, well, you guys broke all the rules. And that's going to be a convincing argument for Americans. So the British are going to be making a lot of propaganda statements toward Americans with the idea of shifting public opinion to their side. And they are successful at that. Okay. So slowly, as the war goes on, American public opinion is going to support the British against the Germans. The result of the attack on the Lusitania was that Wilson made an announcement that it was going to hold all parties to strict accountability. Strict accountability means that if you do this, if you break the rules of war, again, the United States is going to go to war. And the Germans weren't really afraid of the United States, but they knew that the balance of power was so close that if the United States got involved, it could be a death blow. And so the result was they decided to suspend their unrestricted submarine warfare for the next few years, and that keeps the United States out of the war. And then in 1916, there's an election in the United States, and Woodrow Wilson is reelected on the platform, he kept us out of war.